Thank you very much. We have a lot to cover tonight. The subject is the economics of our future. And you cannot talk about the economics of our future until we discuss the economics of our past. Because the past is always with us. The past influences the present. It makes the future. I want to go way back and look at something. Too many things that we forget. Too many things that we have forgotten that how we survived on this earth. And it calls to my attention something that came to my mind when I, as a Baptist Sunday school teacher, began to ask some serious questions about white angels. All the people who died in the world, all over the world, only the white angels got up there? Where are the rest of them? Because we know so much about the economic system of our oppressor, we do not understand that we created an economic system before there was a Europe. We created and sustained ourselves for thousands of years on an economic system of our creation before communism and before capitalism and before socialism. What makes us think that if we fashion an economic system, it must be either capitalist or socialist? The one that we fashioned before was pure socialist, and we did not call it by any name. We must begin to understand that we lived out things without proclaiming them. And our economic system related to our cultural system and our spiritual system. We did not have to say we are our brother's keeper, because once you have to say it, I suspect you don't want to do it. But once you mean it, you don't say it, you just go ahead and do it. Now, what kind of economic system am I talking about? Because no one can exist without an economic system. No one can exist without a spiritual system, because the spiritual system feeds into the cultural system. So we are talking about three things here that the African people of the world were able to combine into one, because the priest was also the scientist, and the priest was also at the heart of the basis of the culture. Now, how then could people sustain themselves for thousands of years before they knew there was a European in the world? It is hard for you to stretch your imagination to realize that the only functioning world of one time in the world was you. And you didn't go to ask anyone to erect a system for you, because there was no one to ask. And years before Europe emerged, you couldn't ask them, because they were in disarray and in confusion about what kind of economic system they had to have. Once you separate your economic system from your cultural system and your spiritual system, you are in serious trouble. The Africans were able to tie this system all together as one and the same. And this is what I'm trying to ask people to get back to. I am not saying that you need to pray before you eat a piece of bread. I'm saying that once the totality of the spiritual and the cultural meet They create the economic system because the economic system is based on basic needs. You did not say give to each according to his needs. You just did it. You did not say in this economic system before the interference of Europe that a man with 6 children deserves more space and more food than a man with 2 children. You just did it. You did not say that there are people in your family and in your community that needed basic protection and consideration. You just did it. Now, what kind of economic system did we have in a community at a time when there was no word for jail because no one had ever gone to one? No word for old people's home because no one had ever thrown away grandma and grandpa. No word for orphanages because no one had ever thrown away their children. We are people politically naive and culturally naive because we have bought someone else's concept and neglected more important concepts of our own. Looking back at my own growth in my own childhood, looking back at the communities where I lived, there was an economic system of survival, and this survival was one of the great miracles. And if a people can survive before the American Depression and after the American Depression, they can survive anything in front of them. And when I look at the economic system in a community where no man made over $15 a week, some had 9 children, ours had 6, subsequently 9, how did we survive? What kind of personal economic system did we have in our home? My father made $14 a week. The rent was $8 a month. Every one of those children had to have at least 1 pair of shoes a year. You got that 1 pair of shoes. You kept them on until the first robin of spring, and you took them off. Got to the point I hated robins. Once they showed up, off goes the shoe. First frost in the winter, you could put them back on. You simply didn't wear them during the summer. When you got industrial and do a little catting, pick a little blackberries or dewberries, well, you southerners don't know what a don't know what a dewberry is. A dewberry is a blackberry that comes ahead of the blackberry ripe. Not as sweet as the blackberry. And a dewberry cobbler is not as sweet as a blackberry cobbler. And it's considered low-class food, but it was our class food because we had no other resource. Now, when I was looking back and thinking about the economics of my own survival in the community, and the fact that I was the soap maker for the community, I would gather the bones and the lye and the grease and put it all together, get my fire, boil it, let it cool down, pour it out in a platter, cut it into bars. I never remember any money exchange at any time. You would go to a lady, she's got 6 children, well, that's kind of a 3-bar family. You didn't say, because all you and your youngest, you need 3, you need 3 bars. You didn't argue with anybody. You didn't badmouth anybody. That's a 3-bar family with 6 children. Well, it's going to take about 3 bars to wash all of those clothes. So you gave it. Go to another one, that's 2. Go to another, but single, that's 1. But everybody shared in the commonality of of soap, basic soap. One lady's good at fixing greens. You go to her house and this, Miss Ada, may I have some greens? But you go in the back and pick them. Now, if you got a 6-part family, you pick enough for them. Got a 2-part family, you pick enough for 2 parts. You didn't overdo it. And you left some for other people. The lady across the street, she's good at tomatoes. So you go there and pick, you got a whole salad, you got a basis of a dinner in the whole neighborhood and not Nicholas Pie. What are we talking about? We're talking about an ancient custom that kept us surviving in our time. Barter, common kindness, and giving to each according to his needs, or not according to how well you like him or don't like him. We're talking about a form of internal survival that other people would later call socialism, that we didn't call anything other than community living and getting together. I never remember, of all the children born into my family, I never remember being at home when a child was born. Because on the eve of birth, one of the neighbors took all the children and took care of them, fed them and washed them. And when the wife is given birth and she's strong enough to get up and continue, then the children come back home. I always liked these periods because eating at other people's house and wanted to impress me, I ate better. This was not only an economic thing, this was a spiritual thing and a cultural thing, and you cannot separate one from the other, because if you take away one component, the other is weakened to the point where it is no longer real. Right. You tie all 3 of these things together, and there's no money exchange. And if someone wants some tomatoes, you don't argue based on whether you passed me by the other day and didn't speak to me, you ain't gonna get no my tomatoes. None of that kind of high-minded nonsense. But you're not gonna go out there and pick the if they're able-bodied, you're not gonna go in your garden and pick the tomatoes for them. You go out and pick your own tomatoes. They're in the back, go and, you take your little bucket and you pick them. We managed to survive in that community by exchange, one to the other, because everything in the community, to an extent, was the collective property of everybody who lived in the community. The African, in his early economic system, he would no more kill a deer, put the deer down and said, "This is mine," then he would fly. He would put it in a central place. Those who went out and killed the deer, put it in the central place, then the deer skinners come forward. If you've hunted the deer, you don't have to skin him too. So those who are specialists at skinning him, skins him. Those who special chop him up, come and chop him up. Then they put the meat on little platters of green leaves. We call elephant leaves. Each family picks up a portion of meat based on how much they need, and there's no argument at the picking up. Everybody knows the needs of every family. Finally, the deer is distributed among all of them. There has been no money. The hunters didn't get paid. The skinners didn't get paid. Nobody got paid. Those who picked up the meat and took it home didn't pay. But they were all surviving. Now, a misguided man named Karl Marx would later come along and codify all of this and say that what the African was doing was primitive communism. Wasn't primitive at all. What they were doing was advanced civilization, because it respected the humanity of every man who lived in his community. That was unique. Now, what we have to do is start reversing these classifications and examining them on our terms and giving them a classification that respects our humanity, that identifies our humanity in the world when we were cooperating one to the other and did not compete to the point where we create antagonism one to the other. I am beginning by examples from my own life because that's the best research I can do. I don't have to go into the books. I just have to dig down inside and bring it back up. Now, during the period of farming, my father was a frustrated farmer. He was a good farmer, technically, but having been driven from the land and decided he wasn't going to sharecrop anymore, he went back and finally ended up sharecropping again anyway. But of all the black farmers in the village, we all farmed our independent farms. It came time to dig because when you take a potato out of the ground, it can't be a slow process. So farmer A brings his group to take all the potatoes out of the ground of this farmer. Then you make the kills. The young men are making the kills. That's why I know so much about the kills, because that was my job. Lay hay in a very dry place. Lay down the hay, take corn stalks and make them up almost like an Indian teepee. Then put mud up against all of that so it'd be almost waterproof and airproof. You put your potatoes on the soft bed of hay, and they'll last all winter. Once you get this one potatoes done, you go to the next one. I mean, there's no exchange. And but I'm gonna dig my potatoes on a certain day, bring your hands. The fact that you bring your hands, bring those members of your family who is able-bodied enough to participate. And when you say, I'm going to dig tomorrow, you bring your hands. Oh, now suppose you only got 2, and this one has got 6. You don't argue about this. So many things we argue about today, people didn't argue about. No, what could he do? He's only had 2 hands. 2 boys and himself, maybe 3. And he's not apologizing for having 6. And he's not boasting about having 6. And he's not saying, I brought 6 hands to your potato digging, and now you only bring 2 to mine. We argue about nonsense, human things that we can't do anything about. What do you want? His wife to go to rush to the bedroom and produce some more children? What? I mean, what we were practicing was a form of Christian humanity, one to the other. We were not engaging in an argument because all of us had to survive. When it came the time to raise the roof on the house, no one man can put a roof on the house. The roof is fixed off of the house, then you got to pick it up and take strong men to raise it and put it on top of the frame. So you ask for the strongest hands you can get. And all those strong hands will eventually have to raise the roof for themselves and have to call on some of the others to do the same thing. What we are dealing with an absence in our culture life that we need to get back again. Once the fall of certain members of our family, once we no longer had a place for grandma in the home, we had dismissed our Supreme Court, and our culture is in trouble. When you could no longer give the boy the stimulus and the strength, saying, go to grandma, grandma take care of it. And I just love to go to grandma, because the minute I get in a little trouble, grandma says, send the boy to me. I start feeling good. She's over 100. Now, how hard can she hit? She's going to the motion of punishing me. And I swear she was hugging me. Those licks didn't feel like no licks. give me one whack and put her arms all around me and scold me with her eyes and give me another, you know. And when it's all over and I finish my fake crying, pour me a glass of buttermilk and give me a cold sweet potato. That's love. Grandma and Dad. Grandma is not there anymore. You got a two-bedroom apartment. Your children got one bedroom. You and your husband got the other. You ain't got no roll-out couch in the living room. Now where Grandma gonna stay? The city has killed a humane happening in our life and in our economic system that we need to get back again. Grandma and Grandpa, suppose they both come to visit at the same time. Where they gonna stay? You can't spend an apartment in 2 rooms to 2 rooms. 2 bedroom, 2 bedroom. You can't add another one. And it's astronomical if you rent a space that has 3 bedrooms. More astronomical now than ever. Why am I starting up front in order to work backward to ancient economics? Because all history, I repeatedly say, is a current event. And if you don't understand the present, you're not going to understand the past. And we have lost too many things in our life that influenced our economics. And the one thing that used to influence our church, the economics of our church, for the women in the church. In the midst of all of those women, there inevitably was a woman we call Big Mama. With the decline of Big Mama-ism, something went out of our culture. We're listening to foreigners in their talks. We're listening to nonsense about what men don't let women tell them to do. We lost something. Because the Big Mama was literally the advisor to the church. She was the main economic advisor to that church. All the willing women's committee came under her. The coal committee, we didn't have no furniture in those days, came under her. The committee for the pastor's vacation came under her. All Big Mama said she was an empress. And she did not demean a single man or make a single man feel less than a man, but she furnished some strength so that his man could survive. And she did not detract from any of it or attack him. And yet, she chose the pastors for those churches, and she did it in such quiet and diplomatic way. Everybody knows that that was the real ruler of the church. When we got into this male-female nonsense, thinking that females don't supposed to have positions of authority, and it kind of hurts our feelings to see them bossing things around, so many structures begin to fall apart in a basic economic system, a latch pin that held it together, because she played a much better role than just being Big Mama. She was wise mama too, and yet she did not use her wisdom offensively. Now, with the decline of Big Mama-ism in the community and in the church, we began to rely more and more on the man alone. Because the man alone cannot sustain himself, he cannot give birth to himself, and he is not totally independent of women ever. And he came out of a society when there was so much balance, it was conceded the fact that if you got a god, you had to have a goddess, because there was, if a man was a god, he couldn't be a god without a goddess, because he has no balance without a goddess. He conceded this long ago. He conceded this when the European woman, who was going to become the European woman, was a beast of burden. Once we let certain things go out of our life, listening to foreigners and listening to messages that wasn't even meant for us, we began to lose an internal cultural thing in our economics that we need to get back today. All right, now, let's go way back. Let's go back to how these villages in the ancient world sustained themselves, ultimately protected themselves. We are talking about a world when there were no Europeans in the world that could be identified. I know this is a strain on your imagination, but there was a period when, before the first European wore a shoe or lived in a house that had a window, when people still ate, they still wore clothes, they still had equipment, they still traveled, and nobody knew that a European was in the world. How then did they sustain themselves? They hadn't heard about capitalism because it hadn't been invented. They hadn't heard about socialism because that hadn't been invented. Then how could they manage without all these white things that wasn't there? They managed very well. They managed very well because they realized something. They realized something that the European would reverse later on, that land is sacred and land is the property of all people and not the property of any big land owner. Land could neither be bought or sold because land was sacred. Land was the giver. Land was the economic mother. It was from the land that man got something that he needed to sustain him as a human being and to sustain his family. First, these small village people became suspicious of the other village people on the other side of the river or on the other side of the mountain. Once they lost this suspicion and began to unite, these clusters of villages ultimately became communities and part of a city. Then they decided they needed some form of protection, and they began to create the embryo of an army, a force of protection. And if a man spends all of his time protecting, he still had to eat, he still had to have shoes or sandals, he still had to live in some kind of housing. So they knew then that they had to accumulate a surplus so that the non-farming people could eat, because the non-farming people had been assigned to other things to do and couldn't farm and protect at the same time. Now they understood something about distribution. And because the priest was the guardian of the wealth and not the owner of the wealth, he presided over the wealth to make sure that everyone got their proper share. And when two people married, it was his responsibility to make sure they had enough land to feed their respective families. Then in the river valleys of Africa, an economic factor emerged that is not only good for that time, it is good for all time. They began to produce a kind of food that did not perish so long as it's kept in a dry place and kept away from water or moisture. They began to produce a bean, dried beans, that they could thaw out any time of year, add another substance, and have a meal. When this began on the river valleys of Africa, and people moved down the Nile from the upper to the lower Nile and formed a city, and a people would later be called the Egyptians, when they began the great period of building, They had no multimillionaires to say, I've got to accumulate so much money, you know, to get this pyramid built, and read my lips, I will not increase the taxes. Wasn't no taxes. And yet they got it up there. Use your imagination. What kind of economic system that people had to have in order to build structures of this nature? The man building the structure couldn't farm and build the structure at the same time. And yet it has been proven that the man building the pyramids was indeed a farmer. Once the river lost its erratic temperament and began to overflow with consistency, the farmers knew exactly when the river was going to overflow, so they would get out of the way of the river. In the long months when the river is rising and spilling that rich soil along its banks, what are the men going to do? You can't farm during that period. It's a marshland. So someone hit upon the genius of building great structures. And if you go to Egypt, every single great structure, every single temple is on a rise away from the river where the water could not have touched it. Now, in building the Aswan Dam, to show you what modern stupidity can do for you, in building the Aswan Dam, now I had a clash with the American Communist Party on this, and eventually I had to tell them to go to hell. I said that because I'd gotten this from Egyptian engineers, that Russia built the dam so fast, they threw the natural flow of the river out of balance to the point where water is now seeping under the Sphinx and under the pyramids to the point where some of them might fall down. Now these ancient African engineers 5,000, 6,000 years ago, they knew where to put those buildings. Away from the water, away from the moisture. Modern food with all their engineering school ability now builds a dam that ultimately is going to destroy most of the great monuments in Egypt. Because they built the dams where the water flows in such a way it seeps under the monuments on the upper bank of the river. My point was that America should have taken the job because they have more experience in building dams and smaller booster dams as against large monumental dams. The Russians built it to outdo the Americans. The Americans had been requested to do it first. The way the Russians built it, 3 or 4 villages were flooded and a few thousand people died because they refused to move out of their village. Monuments are under the ground that need not, under the water, they need not be under the water. This poor engineering did a damage to Egypt and to African people. Now, I'm looking at the river as the builder and furnishing the first great economic system in the world. Now, you have to stretch your imagination to assume that an economic system could be built before Europe used the word economics, before the European figured out how he was going to pay for his shoes. All of this was already done. I am saying that this system of building eventually led to the consolidation of the world's first great state, the first state to be known to the world. It is difficult to get across to my own people that you did things thousands of years ago better than they are being done right now. You keep going back to systems of people, systems that wasn't designed for you. Now look at the economics of rent. There's very few of you whose rent hasn't been tripled within the last 15 years. House that once cost 100, now it's costing 500. What kind of economic system are we dealing with? Why 1/3 of all the houses are boarded up? Why are there so many empty apartments they don't let people move into? They are warehousing housing until they can change the clientele. Why is it that someone plans something called planned shrinkage, published in the newspapers? You can get it as a document. The planned shrinkage was to shrink the housing in New York City so that the poor blacks and the poor whites would move out. And New York would become a bedroom community for middle-class whites and the clerks on Wall Street, because they got tired of the Long Island Railroad and the breakdowns and the snowing, the snowed in, and not being able to get to work, and the breakdown of the cars. They got tired of all that nonsense. So who do they dismember? They dismember the poor. Who do they throw out? They throw out the poor. I am pointing to a factor that you need to understand. You've got an economic system now without heart and without humanity. And I'm pointing to an economic system in the ancient world that you created that had humanity for every human being that walked on the earth. The offender had a decent home. The prisoner had a decent home. And whatever faults existed in that civilization, everybody had enough to eat. And this was brought about through the world's first massive agricultural system of farming. And barter trade, where you trade goods and services without any trade of money. The economic system of the world began to lose its humanity with the invention of hard currency. And hard currency was not invented in the West. Paper currency was really a Chinese invention. And the Chinese invented paper currency to keep from carrying the burden of carrying so much hard currency around. There was a time salt was the currency. There was a time cowrie shells was the currency. Different things became currency at different times in history. Now, when you look at the ancient African concept of survival and feeding and clothing, it was based on his spirituality. And the spirituality dictates this is a human being. He needs covering. You don't argue the cost of it. It's a human being like myself. He needs certain basic things. He will get it. These same systems existed in the Pacific. It existed in the South Sea Islands. It existed in most of the world. But once the world created a common currency, a kind of a exchange currency like gold and silver, that's when people began to try to accumulate more of that than they needed for themselves. Prior to that, man took what he needed, so there was always something left for others. And the economics would change. All right, now, this ancient world continued with this economic system It had its armies. It had its basic defense. It had all the basic things they needed to move from one place to the other. In all the investigations of that ancient world, there was no hunger. There was no homeless people. And yet people travel, because protection and economics was built into the culture of the people. And the ruler of the country very often was the chief craftsman in the country and the priest. And he was as close to a scientist as we got to in that day. Western man created a conflict between science and religion. The Africans knew that science and religion was one and the same. And the great scholar Ahmed Barber at the University of St. Khoury at Timbuktu admonished his students, believe in God and science. Because he knew that God and science was one and the same. When man began to separate God from science, science was in trouble. The spirituality of people were in trouble. They did not engage in that fakery that's so prevalent in the United States called the separation of church and state. It's the biggest lie they ever told. This is a country designed for free, as a haven for free white Protestant males, middle class and up, those who agreed with the prevailing political status quo and who owned property. Nobody else ever will, ever did, or will rule this country. Wasn't designed for white women either. They got the vote day before yesterday. They were sold on the auction block. One designed for the Jews, will they have illusion? One designed for the Catholics, although they're the best politicians in the world, religious politicians, of course. Nobody has been president of the United States except one Catholic almost became president and was about to finish his term before they knocked him off. The little Greek with his Jewish wife, he wasn't going to become a president in no kind of way. Because he had two elements the United States wasn't ready to deal with. His Greekism and his Jewish wife. They don't want no kind of Jew to become within smelling distance of the presidency. They're not our rules, it's their rules. So when you look at the nation, way a nation is designed, you will understand the economic system that governs that nation. The free white Protestant males must prevail on the top. They have old money. They built an economic system based on exploitation, based on depriving so many people of certain things so there can be a deliberate imbalance. And these old crusty millionaires who made a lot of money in the slave trade and who still got some of that money, they pay to keep that name out of the paper. As some new little egomaniac, he paid to get his name in the paper. These old ones pay to get their name out of the paper. Now let's go back to this ancient time that is less confusing, because there was a simplicity in this life that made for a lessening of complications, because your religion, your economic system, and your culture system was one and the same, and no one made any lies up about one being separated from the other. and they lived a pretty decent life, and they did not war on religions. And I should not use the word religions at this point. I should use the word spirituality and its variations, because formal organized religions did not exist. And when formal organized religions came into being, they began to impinge on the economic system. Because when you had spirituality absent from organized religion, the people sustained the temple, so you didn't have to take up any money. The people sustained the priest, so you didn't have to take any money for him, because he was the prophet of the people and the servant of the people. Things was comparatively simple. Now I have referred to a PhD thesis written by a Ghanaian that I still have and study once in a while on why African religions never became world religions. Now I accept Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as a derivative of African religions because the elements that made them came out of Africa. But I'm talking about the more indigenous African religions that still exist in some form to this day. And the young student in his PhD thesis called attention to the fact that in African religion there was no vast decoration, no silk robes with piping, no fancy organs that had to be paid for. There was a simplicity, and the people maintained the priest, so the priest didn't have to ask for money inasmuch as he was given everything he needed to sustain him. When he had to travel one place to the other, he was taken. So what did he need money for? And these religions that had no money exchange, but these religions supported a common economic system that made sure that everybody in the society had a share of everything in the society. And when there wasn't enough, they called a council and they moved to other places, scouted other places, and moved to places where food was more abundant, where water was more plentiful and dependable in its supply. Now I'm saying again, once you look at the economic system of this period and look at the economic system of any people in the world, the economic system ties with the cultural system. And there's three things you absolutely must have in good supply: land, water, and women. Land, because without land you can't produce any food. Without water, life will not sustain very well, very long. Without women, you cannot replace and reproduce your generation. And anytime one of those items are absent, you're not only in economic trouble, you are in cultural trouble and you are in spiritual trouble. Because the Greek Tacitus said, man plagued by hunger and cold pays no heed to God or the soul. It is difficult to be spiritual if your child is hungry and you see somebody else with a loaf of bread. It is difficult to be merciful given that situation. That means that one of those items are somewhere missing in the economic structure. All right, now, this continued until they encountered foreigners. And these foreigners did not understand the system and began to take more than their share. First foreigners coming from Western Asia. And once the first foreigners were expelled, 1,000 years of building and structure would pass, and economic well-being before the foreigners came back again. The Assyrians, 660 BC. Then the Iranians, 550 BC, under the general Cambyses. And the Iranians were so bad in the wrecking of the economic system, but the wreck of the economic system also wrecked the cultural and the spiritual system. The invader is no respecter of kith and kin. The invader is no respecter of the culture, because the first thing the invader sees is the woman. Now, when you interfere with the people's supply of land, water, and women, you have interfered with their economic system. Because you've also interfered with their cultural system, you've also interfered with their spiritual system. The ancient African kept all these systems intact, and they did not get out of being intact until the coming of the foreigners. Now, with the Iranians, who then call themselves Phoenicians and some other phony name, which isn't true, the Africans cried out, "Oh God, if you cannot send me a liberator, send me a conqueror that will show mercy." And true to his word, Alexander did show mercy. Some people say I let him off the hook. He was a European too. He was a raper too, I admit that. He raided the granary of Egypt. And he raided the grain of Egypt to feed his Greek army, to the point there wasn't enough grain left for the Egyptians. You see the interference of the foreigner who not understand the economic system. See the ice interfering with the sun after the sand has interfered with the sun. The African, who is the sun, stands at the center of the world. And I said that these are the people with the sun personality. The Western Asia, these are the people with the sand personality. The Europeans, these are the people with the ice personality. Once these personalities begin to interfere with each other, there is an imbalance that otherwise wouldn't be there. Egypt had enough granary. Alexander now raised it to feed his soldiers. Now all of these parasites are living on Africa and giving nothing back. People are taking grain without producing any grain. In this imbalance now, the civilization of the valley is in trouble. This trouble would continue. Finally, the misbehavior of the Greeks would open the door for another greedy, ambitious southern European people. Now I won't get into this, but I can make a better case for Greece and Rome not being a part of Europe than anybody can make for Egypt not being a part of Africa. I can make a much better case, because the rest of Europe didn't exist. The word Egypt appears in the Bible about 120 times. Germany don't appear once. France don't appear once. Hungary don't appear once. Russia don't appear once. Wasn't no Russia. The word Ethiopia appears in the Bible 80 times. No other nation attached to Europe, except the Greeks and the Romans, appeared in the Bible, and they appear fleetingly, but the Bible is generally about Egypt and the nations in Africa. Now, there's going to be another economic setback. The coming of the Romans. Well-dressed rapers, taking everything in sight, taking the women, it's another imbalance, taking the land, another imbalance, polluting the water, another imbalance. When they destroyed the city of Carthage, they destroyed more than a city. They destroyed an economic system that built the city. Now they must call Carthaginians back to rebuild the city. Carthaginians have no heart in rebuilding a city for foreigners who destroyed it in the first place. So the city never comes back in full flower. And the Carthaginians never tell them about the economic system they had that sustained the city. People speak about the Roman Empire and quite forget that the bulk of the Roman Empire, the geographical domains of the Roman Empire, was in Africa. Physically in Africa, the largest physical part. Now you have killers in Africa who call on their gods to sanction that killing. We must look back again on a fact that if we recognize this, we will deal with certain current things. We are the creators of the basis and the elements that went into the making of all salvation-oriented religions. There isn't a salvation-oriented religion any place in the world that can't be traced in some part to Africa. So now you know the religions you did not create. You know immediately you didn't create Jehovah's Witnesses. That is a doom-oriented religion. We get Armageddon every day. We don't have to wait for that. Every time the rent man comes, that's Armageddon. Armageddon knocking at the door. We don't need no preparation for that. That's a daily occurrence, a catastrophe in our lives. All right, now, because this economic system was tied to the religious system and the cultural system, these foreigners didn't understand this because they practiced a religion that had a God of vengeance. This is what Adolf Hitler meant when he said, give us back our old gods who glorified murder and who rewarded the murderer. He wasn't doing anything too exceptional. Many Europeans had gone back to him anyway. They'd gone back to the old gods. The Catholic Church, to a great extent, had endorsed the old gods. When the Pope said in 1455 to the Spaniards and the Portuguese, you are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. All they had to do to call you, to justify slavery, to say you're an infidel. Okay, now, you can see that the foreigners who did not understand the collective nature of culture, spirituality, and land and people have wrecked the economy of the Nile Valley. They've also wrecked the administration of the religion that had played a major role in the economy. Finally, they are expelled. And the grumbling of a camel boy would bring another system into being in this part of the world. The system was Islam. Islam did something that was so damaging to Africa, it hurts Africa today. And in spite of all the apologies, they interfered with the concept that once worked together, land, water, and women. They took the women wholesale. They took the land. Land went to the biggest conqueror. They didn't preserve the water. They brought an orderly language, a system of accounting, but they did not bring an economic system. Now we have to deal with one of the great fakeries in history, the myth of Arab science. A people comes out of the desert in the 700s. In the 900s, they got a science. In the 900s, 9th century, they had finished stealing Egyptian science, codified it in their name, and announced to the world that that was a great new science. Europe fell for that job and began to almost be beholden to Arab science, Islamic science, like the Americans and the Europeans later became beholden to German science, until the Japanese studied German science and out-scienced them. But this myth of Arab science gave the Arab an intellectual position in the world that literally made people afraid of him. He created no science. You're going to come out of the desert and you're going to create a science in one century and create a science the next century. Science don't grow that fast. Scientists don't develop that fast. But the coming of Islam changed the pattern not only of the economic system, but changed the cultural system from the matrilineal to the patrilineal. The African was contented to let the land and to let the lineage come down through the female side. Now everything is coming down through the male side, because the African did not feel inferior, he did not feel put upon in the presence of a female who had power. And the matrilineal assured her of power. Didn't assure her of power just because she was a female. She still had to wait her turn. When it came her turn, no one could keep her from assuming the responsibility of her turn. Okay, now, the Romans eventually were driven back into Europe. We're talking about economics now. And they began to create an economic system in Europe that has influenced them from that day to this one. Feudalism. Feudalism didn't disappear. Slavery didn't disappear. They were merely transformed. Feudalism became capitalism. Slavery became economic exploitation. The transformation of the system as against the elimination of the system. Now, if we're going to have an economic system in the future, we're going to have to look at the economic systems of the past. We're going to have to look at Islam as a new economic system, more economic than spiritual. Because it began to dominate everything. Now we're looking at the challenge to Africa. The economic basis of the Saharan gold trade, controlled by Ghana, because Ghana stood astride the trade routes leading from North Africa into Inner Africa, down through Timbuktu and Kano. And the Africans then, controlling this trade, began to gather the goods and the services needed in North Africa and Southern Europe, and part of that economic system was depending on this trade. There's a good book on it. There's a good book on everything, of course. The Golden Trade of the Moors is a popular book on the subject. But a more scholarly book with more information on it by the same writer, E.W. Bovell, is Caravans of the Old Sahara. There are many books on it. That just happened to be one of them. I think Eleanor Hoffman's work, Land of the Evening Star, dealing with Spain and the land of the Moors, is a more readable book on the subject. There's an excellent work in French by one of the best African writers in this area, Cézanne Moody. And it deals with Timbuktu as a commercial city. Then If You Forgive the Modesty, there's also a moderately valuable article on the subject by John Clarke called The Search for Timbuktu and the Africans in the Conquest of Spain. Another article called The Africans in the Conquest of Spain. Now, if you want to deal with the economic impact of the Europeans on Africa's economy, there's a much longer article in a book called The Horizon History of Africa. The ninth book deals with the coming of the chapter dealing with the coming of the Europeans by Edu Boan. And the eighth chapter deals with the impact of the Europeans on the cultural and economic status of Africans that I wrote. It's called Africa, Time of Trouble. Now that the foreigners are coming in with a new economic system, they are throwing out of balance the three things that must be in balance if you're going to have a civilization: land, women, and water. So one of them out of balance and you're in trouble. Take one of them away and you are in trouble. Interfere with the normal cultural flow of any one of them and you're in trouble. Now we see an economic system in trouble. But the Africans in West Africa, inner West Africa, would build another economic system based on external and internal trade. Trade from the outside, trade from the inside. Based on an internal agriculture that made sure that everyone's got enough to eat. And based on, before the coming of Islam, one of the great gifts of Islam was the embryo of a form of African capitalism. Many Africans who were Muslim became rich at the expense of less endowed Africans. Be that it may, this system and this process of change would last 1,000 years and it would still hold on to some of the older, more humane elements of an African economic system. While along the coast of West Africa, there were traders trading posts down that coast. Africans who sold pepper in Mauritania might also have a family selling pepper in Ghana, and what later to become Ghana. Africans who were specialized in the creation and the marketing of certain things generally had a network that controlled that particular thing. Now you're beginning to see a change in the basic economic system and the beginning of networks of traders. When these networks of traders fail to let their network be used as a form of solicitation in the slave trade, Europeans began to bring in Lebanese type, Arab types. And they began to have a war on the Africans who mastered the trade. The war on the African concept of economic well-being. One of the best cases in Nigeria, where a king who was a slave twice in one lifetime and a king twice in one lifetime. This is why you cannot look at the nonsense about if the Africans were doing it too. This is why the slave trade was, because the Africans sold us the slaves and the Africans were in the slave trade before we got there. It is all a lie. The Africans had a form of internal servitude that was not slavery. Not a single human being was sent out of Africa. Not a single family was broken up. I'm not saying it was good or bad. I'm saying it was not the same, and it had no resemblance to the Europeans. Once the Europeans came out of the lethargy of the Middle Ages, discovered longitude and latitude in the 1400s, began to put ships at sea, and began to understand what direction to use in getting the ship from one place to the other, the Europeans began to build an economic system on depriving other people. He wasn't asking permission. He didn't ask to share. He just took his gun and took it. Began to interfere with the family structure of Africa that was basically the economic structure of Africa. Now Africa's economic system is out of balance because you've got a trader now without honor. The slave trade was a European economic system that wrecked the African's basic internal economic system. Africa was wrecked and drained so that Europeans can have something over and above what they wanted and what they were tied to. If you study the history of European dress, the kings wasn't well dressed before. The women wasn't well dressed before. They never knew silk until after the Crusades, and they began to bring silk into Europe. Fine fabrics from the East. Europe is now recovering at the expense of other people's economic system. Now they would build with slavery an economic system in the Caribbean because we brought African elements of an economic system with us to the New World. And some of us brought African plants to the New World. We knew certain things that Europeans still do not know, is that the forest was a drugstore. The danger in the world that certain parts of the world, including certain parts of Africa, may become a desert because the Europeans, in their insatiable desire for wood, are tearing down the drugstore. In the forest there were different plants. Along the river banks there were different plants that you could use. The old ladies knew how to identify each plant, and nobody ever got poisoned because no one ever was fed a poison plant. Now, I don't care what you call those old ladies, those old men who with these herbs. I don't care what you call them, but they were chemists. They were scientists. And they were doing a scientific job. Now, when we came to the United States, some of this could be maintained in the Caribbean islands, principally because the families were not broken up as ruthlessly and as often as they're in the United States. And an island is a culture container. If they sell grandma to the other side of our plantation on the other side of, you can walk and see her. But in the United States, where they broke up the families often, they didn't even tell you where Cousin Willie went. He'd be sold to one state, he might be resold within a week after he got there. This horse trading. What are they destroying? They're destroying the culture system, and they're destroying the economic system. And yet we managed to build, in the midst of that, some economics of survival. We hit upon certain vegetables that gave us, almost by accident, a balanced diet. And most of them were vegetables white people were walking over and ignoring. Certain greens, certain wild potatoes, certain basic things that we did. Then, for meat, we had to get that part of the meat that white people discarded and make a delicacy out of it. You can have your war against pork if you want to, and you may be justified. But there was a time when that was all we could get, was that part of the pig they threw away. So we made a delicacy out of the feet. We made a delicacy out of the guts, chitlins. We made sauce out of the head, hog head sauce, all different kinds of salt. The Caribbeans made one kind of salt, we made another kind, but we all utilized it. It is little known to us, but prior to slavery, we were not a great pork-eating people. We were not a great pork-eating, we were not a great pig-raising people. When Dr. Ben was in the hospital and they wanted to indulge him and asked him what he wanted to eat, so he said pork chop. They gave him pork chop. Lynn Jeffers, with his busybody self, came in and lectured Dr. Ben that, man, you're just coming out of a stroke, you eat that pork, it's going to kill you. And Ben said that, haven't I told you that in ancient Egypt the Pharaoh gathered once a year and fed pork to his favorite guests because this was the meat of the gods? Jeffers said, you are not a Pharaoh, this is not ancient Egypt. Get that pork chop out of there before it kills you. Professor Jeffers took the man's pork chop, and in his first public appearance after he partially recovered from the stroke, he said, I want to make one thing clear. I will be this man's friend, I will help him. But for taking my pork chop, I will never forgive him. And his concept of nation. Now, in the concept of nation, as it visited by Elijah Muhammad, he was preserving the three elements essential to an economic system in the survival of all people: land, water, and women. When you boiled it all down, his concept of nation was to restore to you some of the things that had been taken away. He was a Garveyite. Garvey was an admirer of Booker T. Washington. And so was Du Bois to an extent, though he differed with him, that don't mean he did not admire him. We have to go back and study all of these things and how did people survive before their economic system was interfered with by foreigners. How do you begin an economic system? With self-reliance. If we start making shoes tomorrow, they may not be as good as Flowshine, but you just leave us with those shoes a few years and we'll out Flowshine. Do they not raise in the Caribbean wheat? They can raise a good corn. Now, who told you that wheat is absolutely essential to life? Man was eating before he discovered wheat. And besides, they've got a lot of things that they can use to bargain with people with wheat. Back to barter again. So between the collection of the isles that is agriculturally rich, Trinidad is agriculturally rich. Good drainage, good water supply. Jamaica has a whole lot of land that hasn't been used. And the whole British concept of crown land and reserve land, that land now can be put into production for the people of Jamaica. I'm just using one aspect. Then their relationship with the rest of the African world will get them the other things they need. Because they can be cadres, a collective cadre for African states. They have enough talent to use to get the things they still do not have. Jamaica has the same position in the Caribbean that Nigeria have in Africa. Over half of the lawyers in the whole Caribbean area are Jamaican. Over half of the trained technicians are Jamaican. So Jamaica could be the industrial headquarters of the Caribbean islands. They have the talent, they have the basic know-how, they have the marketing know-how. So that means among themselves they have to discard all of this Protestant nonsense. I went to the Virgin Islands, they said, well, these up islanders. I said, what in the hell is an up islander? And the down islanders. I discovered that in the St. Croix and St. Thomas, the able-bodied local men have spent so much time servicing these unfulfilled white women on the beach that they didn't even have enough local men for police. So I had to send to other islands to get people for police. They said, the down islanders take care of the police force, the up islanders take care of the hotel. The local men wasn't working in the hotel, they wasn't working in the police, they're working on the beach. I'm not advocating that prostitution be an industry any place. I think morally we need to get rid of it all places. Now let's look at this thing internationally. Africa is an underdeveloped continent. The greatest development talent in the world is African talent is outside of Africa. Suppose we collectively, between the Caribbean islands, certain parts of South America, and the United States, collectively computerize our talent. When a given African nation said that I need 1,000 nurses, we could have them ready overnight and on that way. Don't you think we would transform that continent? We need to read Cheikh Anta Diop's little book, Africa, the Politics of a Federal State, when he's trying to show us how to preserve the minerals of Africa for a world still to come. We need to stop this division among us and realize that we are an African people wherever we are on the face of the earth, and that was too long before Jesse Jackson suggested it. Definition of Pan-Africanism. When I said an operational definition, we need a definition that will be just as applicable in Jamaica or Trinidad as it is in Georgia or in Alabama. When we say Pan-Africanism, we mean the same thing. And we mean the same thing in Africa. And then Africans would have to reconsider the concepts of living in borders erected by foreigners that many times split their culture in half, and that different ethnic groups living on different sides of the border, and sometimes the same ethnic groups living in both countries, and cannot unite on an economic basis because the rules over in one border differ from the rules over in another border. We are the world's richest poor people, and that is not a contradiction. We are poor because we have not seized the opportunity to exploit our own community. We have to take a good look at ourselves and how we are going to stay on the earth. There are too many of us in the city. Too many of us left the land. The land became distasteful to us. And after slavery, too many of us left the land, and we have lost millions of acres in land simply because the relatives didn't keep up the taxes. If we're going to have an economic system and go into the 21st century, we're going to have to pull closer to each other and draw from each other certain basic needs we have not drawn before. In African people throughout the world, we need to live again and hope again and mend the long wounds inflicted on all of us as slave masters scattered us in different parts of the world. We need to look beyond the lands and beyond the seas and beyond the centuries and realize wherever we are on the face of the earth, we are a people standing at the crossroads of history. We're at the threshold of power, debating about whether you cross the threshold with your left foot and your right foot. It doesn't matter so long as you get crossed. We need to stop debating nonsense with each other and become a whole people. Then we need to expand Pan-Africanism beyond its narrow base into a concept of an African world union. And we need to understand that being black and beautiful means nothing unless ultimately you're black and powerful. Thank you.